Treatments for unipolar depression. In the United States, around half of those with unipolar depression receive treatment from a mental health professional each year. Access to such treatment differs among ethnic and racial groups. Only 34% of depressed Hispanic Americans and 40% of depressed African Americans receive treatment, compared with 54% of depressed white Americans. In addition, many people in therapy experience depressed feelings as part of another disorder, such as an eating disorder, or in association with changes or general problems that they are encountering in life. Thus, much of the therapy being done today includes a focus on unipolar depression. A variety of treatment approaches are currently in widespread use for unipolar depression. In this chapter, we first look at the psychological approaches, focusing on the psychodynamic, behavioral, and cognitive therapies. We then explore the sociocultural approaches, including a highly regarded intervention called interpersonal psychotherapy. Next, we look at effective biological approaches, including electroconvulsive therapy, antidepressant drugs, and new brain stimulation interventions. In the process, we can see that unipolar patterns of depression are indeed among the most successfully treated of all psychological disorders. Psychological approaches. The psychological treatments used most often to combat unipolar depression come from the psychodynamic, behavioral, and cognitive schools of thought. Psychodynamic therapy, the oldest of all modern psychotherapies, continues to be used widely for depression even though research has not offered strong evidence of its effectiveness. Behavioral therapy, effective primarily for mild or moderate depression, is practiced less often today than it was in past decades. Cognitive therapy and cognitive behavioral therapies have performed so well in research that they have a large and growing following among clinicians. Psychodynamic therapy. Believing that unipolar depression results from unconscious grief over real or imagined losses, compounded by excessive dependence on other people. Psychodynamic therapists seek to help clients bring these underlying issues to consciousness and work them through. Using the arsenal of basic psychodynamic procedures, they encourage the depressed client to associate freely during therapy. Suggest interpretations of the client's associations, dreams, and displays of resistance and transference, and help the person review past events and feelings. Free association, for example, helped one man recall the early experiences of loss that, according to his therapist, had set the stage for his depression. Among his earliest memories, possibly the earliest of all, was the recollection of being wheeled in his baby cart under the elevated train structure and left there alone. Another memory that recurred vividly during the analysis was of an operation around the age of 5. He was anesthetized and his mother left him with the doctor. He recalled how he had kicked and screamed, raging at her for leaving him. Psychodynamic therapists expect that in the course of treatment, depressed clients will eventually gain awareness of the losses in their lives, become less dependent on others, cope with losses more effectively, and make corresponding changes in their functioning. The transition of a therapeutic insight into a real-life change is seen in the case of a middle-aged executive. The patient's father was still living and in a nursing home, where the patient visited him regularly. On one occasion, he went to see his father full of high expectations, as he had concluded a very successful business transaction. As he began to describe his accomplishments to his father, however, the latter completely ignored his son's remarks and viciously berated him for wearing a pink shirt, which he considered unprofessional. Such a response from the father was not unusual, but this time as a result of the work that had been accomplished in therapy. The patient could objectively analyze his initial sense of disappointment and deep feeling of failure for not pleasing the older man. Although this experience led to a transient state of depression, It also revealed to the patient his whole dependent lifestyle, his use of others to supply him with a feeling of worth. This experience added a dimension of immediate reality to the insights that had been achieved in therapy and gave the patient the motivation to change radically his childhood system of perceiving himself in relation to paternal transference figures. Despite successful case reports such as this, researchers have found that long-term psychodynamic therapy is only occasionally helpful in cases of unipolar depression. Two features of the approach may help limit its effectiveness. First, depressed clients may be too passive and feel too weary to join fully into the subtle therapy discussions. And second, they may become discouraged and end treatment too early when this long-term approach is unable to provide the quick relief that they desperately seek. Generally, psychodynamic therapy seems to help most in cases of depression that clearly involve a history of childhood loss or trauma, a long-standing sense of emptiness, feelings of perfectionism, and extreme self-criticism. Short-term psychodynamic therapies have performed better than the traditional, longer-term approaches. Behavioral therapy. Behaviorists, whose theories of depression tie mood to the rewards in a person's life, have developed corresponding treatments for unipolar depression. Most such treatments are modeled after the intervention proposed by Peter Lewinson, the behavioral theorist whose theory of depression was described. In a typical behavioral approach, therapists 1. Reintroduce depressed clients to pleasurable events and activities. 2. Appropriately reward non-depressive behaviors and withhold rewards for depressive behaviors, and 3. Help clients improve their social skills. First, the therapist selects activities that the client considers pleasurable, such as going shopping or taking photos, and encourages the person to set up a weekly schedule for engaging in them. Studies have shown that adding positive activities to a person's life, sometimes called behavioral activation, can indeed lead to a better mood. In the following case description, a therapist describes this process, revealing how detailed the client-therapist planning sessions must be. Alicia had never noticed a connection between her activities and her mood before. The depression had just felt like something that loomed over her, coloring everything. Worry and tension also seemed like constant companions. She now recognized that there were many subtle shifts in her mood, including some moments in which she experienced relief from the depression and accompanying worry. She felt content when she worked in her garden. After many weeks of avoiding friends, she felt relief when she had dinner with her friend Ellen. As Alicia reviewed these activities with her therapist, she also began to identify activities that she could increase during the upcoming week following their therapy session. Alicia thought that getting in touch with more friends could be helpful for her mood. She decided that seeing Ellen again for coffee would be the most logical place to start. Ellen's social personality might help Alicia reconnect with some of her other old friends over time. She planned to set up a coffee date with Ellen either on Wednesday after work or on the following Saturday morning. Alicia also enjoyed the contentment she usually felt when she worked in her pea patch. The therapist asked what she might do the next week in her garden. Alicia realized that she needed to get some mulch, so they wrote down a plan for that activity as well. She agreed that she would report back to the therapist about how she felt during these activities in the next session. While reintroducing pleasurable events into a client's life, the therapist makes sure that the person's various behaviors are reinforced correctly. Behaviorists argue that when people become depressed, their negative behaviors, crying, ruminating, complaining, or self-depreciation, keep others at a distance, reducing chances for rewarding experiences and interactions. To change this pattern, therapists guide clients to monitor their negative behaviors and to try new, more positive ones. In addition, the therapist may use a contingency management approach. systematically ignoring a client's depressive behaviors while praising or otherwise rewarding constructive statements and behavior, such as going to work. Sometimes family members and friends are recruited to help with this feature of treatment. Finally, behavioral therapists may train clients in effective social skills. In group therapy programs, for example, members may work together to improve eye contact, facial expression, posture, and other behaviors that send social messages. These behavioral techniques seem to be of only limited help when just one of them is applied. In one classic study, for example, depressed people who were instructed to increase their pleasant activities showed no more improvement than those in a control group who were told simply to keep track of their activities. However, when two or more behavioral techniques are combined, behavioral treatment does appear to reduce depressive symptoms, particularly if the depression is mild. It is worth noting that Lewinson himself has combined behavioral techniques with cognitive strategies in recent years, in an approach similar to the cognitive behavioral treatments discussed in the next section. Cognitive therapy. Aaron Beck viewed unipolar depression as resulting from a pattern of negative thinking that may be triggered by current upsetting situations. Maladaptive attitudes lead people repeatedly to view themselves, their world, and their future in negative ways, the so-called cognitive, unrelentingly negative thoughts that flood the mind and produce the symptoms of depression. To help clients overcome this negative thinking, Beck has developed a treatment approach that he calls cognitive therapy. He uses this label because the approach is designed primarily to help clients recognize and change their negative cognitive processes and thus to improve their mood. However, the approach also includes a number of behavioral techniques, particularly as therapists try to get clients moving again and encourage them to try out new behaviors. Thus, many theorists consider this approach a cognitive behavioral therapy rather than the purely cognitive intervention implied by its name. Beck's approach is similar to Albert Ellis' rational emotive therapy, but it is tailored to the specific cognitive errors found in depression. The approach follows 4 phases and usually requires fewer than 20 sessions. Phase 1: Increasing activities and elevating mood. Using behavioral techniques to set the stage for cognitive treatment, therapists first encourage clients to become more active and confident. Clients spend time during each session preparing a detailed schedule of hourly activities for the coming week. As they become more active from week to week, their mood is expected to improve. Phase 2: Challenging automatic thoughts. Once people are more active and feeling some emotional relief, cognitive therapists begin to educate them about their negative automatic thoughts. The individuals are instructed to recognize and record automatic thoughts as they occur and to bring their lists to each session. Therapist and client then test the reality behind the thoughts, often concluding that they are groundless. Beck offers the following exchange as an example of this sort of review. Therapist: Why do you think you won't be able to get into the university of your choice? Patient: Because my grades were really not so hot. Therapist: Well, what was your grade average? Patient: Well, pretty good up until the last semester in high school. Therapist: What was your grade average in general? Patient: A's and B's. Therapist: Well, how many of each? Patient: Well, I guess almost all of my grades were A's, but I got terrible grades my last semester. Therapist: What were your grades then? Patient: I got 2 A's and 2 B's. Therapist: Since your grade average would seem to me to come out to almost all A's, why do you think you won't be able to get into the university? Patient: Because of competition being so tough. Therapist: Have you found out what the average grades are for admission to the college? Patient: Well, somebody told me that a B1 average would suffice. Therapist: Isn't your average better than that? Patient, I guess so. Phase 3. Identifying negative thinking and biases. As people begin to recognize the flaws in their automatic thoughts, cognitive therapists show them how illogical thinking processes are contributing to these thoughts. The depressed student, for example, was using dichotomous, all or nothing, thinking when she concluded that any grade lower than A was terrible. The therapists also assist clients in recognizing that almost all their interpretations of events have a negative bias and to change that style of interpretation. Phase 4. Changing primary attitudes. Therapists help clients change the maladaptive attitudes that set the stage for their depression in the first place. As part of the process, therapists often encourage clients to test their attitudes, as in the following therapy discussion. Therapist: on what do you base this belief that you can't be happy without a man? Patient: I was really depressed for a year and a half when I didn't have a man. Therapist: is there another reason why you were depressed? Patient: as we discussed, I was looking at everything in a distorted way. But I still don't know if I could be happy if no one was interested in me. Therapist: I don't know either. Is there a way we could find out? Patient: well, as an experiment, I could not go out on dates for a while and see how I feel. Therapist: I think that's a good idea. Although it has its flaws, the experimental method is still the best way currently available to discover the facts. You're fortunate in being able to run this type of experiment. Now, for the first time in your adult life, you aren't attached to a man. If you find you can be happy without a man, this will greatly strengthen you and also make your future relationships all the better. Over the past several decades, hundreds of studies have shown that Beck's therapy and similar cognitive and cognitive behavioral approaches help with unipolar depression. Depressed adults who receive these therapies improve much more than those who receive placebos or no treatment at all. Around 50 to 60% show a near total elimination of their symptoms. In view of this strong research support, many depression therapists have adopted cognitive and cognitive behavioral approaches, offering them in either individual therapy, group therapy, or cybertherapy formats, all with considerable success. It is worth noting that a growing number of today's cognitive behavioral therapists do not agree with Beck's proposition that individuals must fully discard their negative cognitions in order to overcome depression. These therapists, the new wave cognitive behavioral therapists, including those who practice acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, guide depressed clients to recognize and accept their negative cognitions simply as streams of thinking that flow through their minds, rather than as valuable guides for behavior and decisions. As clients increasingly accept their negative thoughts for what they are, they can better work around the thoughts as they navigate their way through life. Sociocultural approaches. Sociocultural theorists trace the causes of unipolar depression to the broader social structure in which people live and the roles they are required to play. Two groups of sociocultural treatments are now widely applied in cases of unipolar depression: multicultural approaches and family social approaches. Multicultural treatments. Culture-sensitive therapies are designed to address the unique issues faced by members of cultural minority groups. For such approaches, therapists typically have special cultural training and a heightened awareness of their clients' cultural values and the culture-related stressors, prejudices, and stereotypes that their clients face. They make an effort to help clients develop a comfortable, for them, bicultural balance and to recognize the impact of their own culture and the dominant culture on their views of themselves and on their behaviors. In the treatment of unipolar depression, culture-sensitive approaches increasingly are being combined with traditional forms of psychotherapy to help minority clients overcome their disorders. A number of today's therapists, for example, offer cognitive behavioral therapy for depressed minority clients while also focusing on the client's economic pressures, minority identity, and related cultural issues. A range of studies indicate that Hispanic American, African American, American Indian, and Asian American clients are more likely to overcome their depressive disorders when a culture-sensitive focus is added to the form of psychotherapy that they are otherwise receiving. Unfortunately, this kind of combination therapy for depression, while on the increase, is still unavailable to most minority clients. It also appears that the medication needs of many depressed minority clients, especially those who are poor, are inadequately addressed. Minority clients are less likely than white American clients to receive the most helpful antidepressant medications. Family social treatments. Therapists who use family and social approaches to treat depression help clients change how they deal with the close relationships in their lives. The most effective family social approaches are interpersonal psychotherapy and couple therapy. Interpersonal psychotherapy developed by clinical researchers Gerald Klerman and Myrna Weissman. Interpersonal psychotherapy, IPT, holds that any of 4 interpersonal problem areas may lead to depression and must be addressed: interpersonal loss, interpersonal role dispute, interpersonal role transition, and interpersonal deficits. Over the course of around 16 sessions, IPT therapists address these areas. First, depressed people may, as psychodynamic theorists suggest, be having a grief reaction over an important interpersonal loss, the loss of a loved one. In such cases, IPT therapists encourage clients to explore their relationship with the lost person and express any feelings of anger they may discover. Eventually, clients develop new ways of remembering the lost person and also look for new relationships. Second, depressed people may find themselves in the midst of an interpersonal role dispute. Role disputes occur when 2 people have different expectations of their relationship and of the role each should play. IPT therapists help clients examine whatever role disputes they may be involved in and then develop ways of resolving them. Depressed people may also be going through an interpersonal role transition, brought about by major life changes such as divorce or the birth of a child. They may feel overwhelmed by the role changes that accompany the life change. In such cases, IPT therapists help them develop the social supports and skills the new roles require. Finally, some depressed people display interpersonal deficits, such as extreme shyness or social awkwardness, that prevent them from having intimate relationships. IPT therapists may help such clients recognize their deficits and teach them social skills and assertiveness in order to improve their social effectiveness. In the following discussion, the therapist encourages a depressed man to recognize the effect his behavior has on others. Client, after a long pause with eyes downcast, a sad facial expression, and slumped posture, people always make fun of me. I guess I'm just the type of guy who really was meant to be a loner, damn it. Deep sigh. Therapist, could you do that again for me? Client, what? Therapist, the sigh, only a bit deeper. Client, why? Pause, okay, but I don't see what. Okay. Client sighs again and smiles. Therapist, well, that time you smiled, but mostly when you sigh and look so sad I get the feeling that I better leave you alone in your misery. That I should walk on eggshells and not get too chummy or I might hurt you even more. Client, a bit of anger in his voice, well, excuse me. I was only trying to tell you how I felt. Therapist, I know you felt miserable, but I also got the message that you wanted to keep me at a distance, that I had no way to reach you. Client, slowly, I feel like a loner, I feel that even you don't care about me making fun of me. Therapist, I wonder if other folks need to pass this test, too. Studies suggest that IPT and related interpersonal treatments for depression have a success rate similar to that of cognitive and cognitive behavioral therapies. That is, symptoms almost totally disappear in 50 to 60% of clients who receive treatment. After IPT, not only are their depressive symptoms reduced, but clients also function more effectively in their social and family interactions. Not surprisingly, IPT is considered especially useful for depressed people who are struggling with social conflicts or undergoing changes in their careers or social roles. Couple therapy. Depression can result from marital discord, and recovery from depression is often slower for people who do not receive support from their spouse. In fact, as many as half of all depressed clients may be in a dysfunctional relationship. Thus, it is not surprising that many cases of depression have been treated by couple therapy, the approach in which a therapist works with two people who share a long-term relationship. Therapists who offer integrative behavioral couples therapy teach specific communication and problem-solving skills to couples and further guide them to be more accepting of each other. When the depressed person's relationship is filled with conflict, this approach and similar ones may be as effective as individual cognitive therapy, interpersonal psychotherapy, or drug therapy in helping to reduce depression. In addition, depressed clients who receive couple therapy are more likely than those in individual therapy to be more satisfied with their marriage after treatment. Biological approaches. Like several of the psychological and sociocultural therapies, biological treatments can bring significant relief to people with unipolar depression. Usually, biological treatment means antidepressant drugs or popular herbal supplements, but for severely depressed people who do not respond to other forms of treatment, it sometimes means electroconvulsive therapy, an approach that has been around for more than 70 years, or brain stimulation, a relatively new group of approaches. Electroconvulsive therapy. One of the most controversial forms of treatment for depression is electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. Clinicians and patients alike vary greatly in their opinions of this procedure. Some consider it a safe biological approach with minimal risks, others believe it to be an extreme measure that can cause troublesome memory loss and even neurological damage. Despite the heat of this controversy, ECT is used frequently, largely because it is an effective and fast-acting intervention for unipolar depression. The treatment procedure in an ECT procedure, 2 electrodes are attached to the patient's head, and 65 to 140 volts of electricity are passed through the brain for half a second or less. This results in a brain seizure that lasts from 25 seconds to a few minutes. After 6 to 12 such treatments, spaced over 2 to 4 weeks, most patients feel less depressed. In bilateral ECT, 1 electrode is applied to each side of the forehead, and a current passes through both sides of the brain. In unilateral ECT, the electrodes are placed so that the current passes through only one side. The origins of ECT. The discovery that electric shock can be therapeutic was made by accident. In the 1930s, clinical researchers mistakenly came to believe that brain seizures, or the convulsions, severe body spasms, that accompany them, could psychosis rarely suffered from epilepsy, brain seizure disorder, and that people with epilepsy rarely were psychotic, and so concluded that brain seizures or convulsions somehow prevented psychosis. We now know that the observed correlation between seizures and lack of psychotic symptoms does not necessarily imply that one causes the other. Nevertheless, swayed by faulty logic, clinicians in the 1930s searched for ways to induce seizures as a treatment for patients with psychosis. A Hungarian physician named Joseph von Meduna gave the drug metrazole to patients suffering from psychosis, and a Viennese physician named Manfred Sockel gave them large doses of insulin coma therapy. These procedures produced the desired brain seizures, but each was quite dangerous and sometimes even caused death. Finally, an Italian psychiatrist named Ugo Cerletti discovered that he could produce seizures more safely by applying electric currents to a patient's head. And he and his colleague Lucio Bini soon developed ECT as a treatment for psychosis. As you might expect, much uncertainty and confusion accompanied their first clinical application of ECT. Did experimenters have the right to impose such an untested treatment against a patient's will? The schizophrenic arrived by train from Milan without a ticket or any means of identification. Physically healthy, he was bedraggled and alternately was mute or expressed himself in incomprehensible gibberish made up of odd neologisms. The patient was brought in, but despite their vast animal experience, there was great apprehension and fear that the patient might be damaged. And so the shock was cautiously set at 70 volts for 1/10 of a second. The low dosage predictably produced only a minor spasm, after which the patient burst into song. Cerletti suggested another shock at a higher voltage, and an excited and voluble discussion broke out among the spectators. All of the staff objected to a further shock, protesting that the patient would probably die. Cerletti was familiar with committees and knew that postponement would inevitably mean prolonged and possibly permanent procrastination, and so he decided to proceed at 110 volts for 1/2 second. However, before he could do so, the patient who had heard but so far not participated in the discussion sat up and pontifically proclaimed in clear Italian without hint of jargon, "Non una seconda. Mortifera. Not again. It will kill me." Professor Bini hesitated but gave the order to proceed. After recovery, Bini asked the patient, "What has been happening to you?" and the man replied, "I don't know. Perhaps I've been asleep." He remained jargon-free and gave a complete account of himself, and was discharged completely recovered after 11 complete and 3 incomplete treatments over a course of 2 months. ECT soon became popular and was tried out on a wide range of psychological problems, as new techniques so often are. Its effectiveness with severe depression in particular became apparent. Ironically, however, doubts were soon raised concerning its usefulness for psychosis, and many researchers have since judged it ineffective for psychotic disorders, except for cases that also include severe depressive symptoms. Changes in ECT procedures. Although Cerletti gained international fame for his treatments for mental disorders, the reason, he abhorred the broken bones and dislocations of the jaw or shoulders that sometimes resulted from ECT's severe convulsions, as well as the memory loss, confusion, and brain damage that the seizures could cause. Other clinicians have stayed with the procedure, however, and have changed it over the years to reduce its undesirable consequences. Today's practitioners give patients strong muscle relaxants to minimize convulsions, thus eliminating the danger of fractures or dislocations. They also use anesthetics, barbiturates, to put patients to sleep during the procedure, reducing their terror. With these precautions, ECT is medically more complex than it used to be, but also less dangerous and somewhat less disturbing. Patients who receive ECT, particularly bilateral ECT, typically have difficulty remembering some events, most often events that took place immediately before and after their treatments. In most cases, this memory loss clears up within a few months, but some patients are left with gaps in more distant memory, and this form of amnesia can be permanent. Understandably, these patients may become embittered about the procedure. Effectiveness of ECT. ECT is clearly effective in treating unipolar depression. Studies find that between 60 and 80% of ECT patients improve. The approach is particularly effective when patients follow up the initial cluster of sessions with continuation therapy, either ongoing antidepressant medications or periodic ECT sessions. The procedure seems to be particularly effective in severe cases of depression that include delusions. It has been difficult, however, to determine why ECT works so well. After all, this procedure delivers a broad insult to the brain that activates a number of brain areas, causes neurons all over the brain to fire, and leads to the release of all kinds of neurotransmitters, and it affects many other systems throughout the body as well. Although ECT is effective and ECT techniques have improved, its use has generally declined since the 1950s. Two reasons for this decline are the memory loss caused by ECT and the frightening nature of the procedure. Another is the emergence of effective antidepressant drugs. Antidepressant drugs. Two kinds of drugs discovered in the 1950s reduce the symptoms of depression: monoamine oxidase, MAO, inhibitors and tricyclics. These drugs have now been joined by a third group, the so-called second-generation antidepressants, MAO inhibitors. The effectiveness of MAO inhibitors as a treatment for unipolar depression was discovered accidentally. Physicians noted that iproniazid, a drug being tested on patients with tuberculosis, had an interesting effect. It seemed to make the patients happier. It was found to have the same effect on depressed patients. What this and several related drugs had in common biochemically was that they slowed the body's production of the enzyme monoamine oxidase, MAO. Thus they were called MAO inhibitors. Normally, brain supplies of the enzyme MAO break down, or degrade, the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. MAO inhibitors block MAO from carrying out this activity and thereby stop the destruction of activity and, in turn, a reduction of depressive symptoms. Approximately half of depressed patients who take MAO inhibitors are helped by them. There is, however, a potential danger with regard to these drugs. When people who take MAO inhibitors eat foods containing the chemical tyramine, including such common foods as cheeses, bananas, and certain wines, their blood pressure rises dangerously. Thus, people on these drugs must stick to a rigid diet. In recent years, a new MAO inhibitor has become available in the form of a skin patch that allows for slow, continuous absorption of the drug into the client's body. Because the doses absorbed across the skin are low, dangerous food interactions do not appear to be as common with this kind of MAO inhibitor. Tricyclics. The discovery of tricyclics in the 1950s was also accidental. Researchers who were looking for a new drug to combat schizophrenia ran some tests on a drug called imipramine. They discovered that imipramine was of no help in cases of schizophrenia, but it did relieve unipolar depression in many people. The new drug, trade name tofranil, and related ones became known as tricyclic antidepressants because they all share a three-ring molecular structure. In hundreds of studies, depressed patients taking tricyclics have improved much more than similar patients taking placebos. Although the drugs must be taken for at least 10 days before such improvements take hold. About 65% of patients who take tricyclics are helped by them. If depressed people stop taking tricyclics immediately after obtaining relief, they run a high risk of relapsing within a year. If, however, they continue taking the drugs for 5 months or more after being free of depressive symptoms, continuation therapy, their chances of relapse decrease considerably. Certain studies further suggest that patients who take these antidepressant drugs for 3 or more years after initial improvement, a practice called maintenance therapy, may reduce the risk of relapse even more. As a result, clinicians often keep patients on the antidepressant drugs indefinitely. Most researchers have concluded that tricyclics reduce depression by acting on neurotransmitter reuptake mechanisms. Messages are carried from the sending neuron across the synaptic space to a receiving neuron by a neurotransmitter, a chemical released from the axon ending of the sending neuron. However, there is a complication in this process. While the sending neuron releases the neurotransmitter, a pump-like mechanism in the neuron's ending immediately starts to reabsorb it in a process called reuptake. The purpose of this reuptake process is to control how long the neurotransmitter remains in the synaptic space and to prevent it from overstimulating the receiving neuron. Unfortunately, reuptake does not always progress properly. The reuptake mechanism may be too efficient in some people, cutting off norepinephrine or serotonin activity too soon, preventing messages from reaching the receiving neurons, and producing clinical depression. Tricyclics block this reuptake process, allowing neurotransmitters to remain in the synapse longer, and thus increasing their stimulation of the receiving neurons. If tricyclics act immediately to increase norepinephrine and serotonin activity, why do the symptoms of depression continue for 10 or more days after drug therapy begins? Growing evidence suggests that when tricyclics are ingested, they initially slow down the activity of the neurons that use norepinephrine and serotonin. Granted, the reuptake mechanisms of these cells are immediately corrected, thus allowing more efficient transmission of finally adapt to the tricyclic drugs and go back to releasing normal amounts of the neurotransmitters. Now the corrections in the reuptake mechanisms begin to have the desired effect. The neurotransmitters reach the receiving neurons in greater numbers, hence triggering more neural firing and producing a decrease in depression. Soon after tricyclics were discovered, they started being prescribed more often than MAO inhibitors. Tricyclics did not require dietary restrictions as MAO inhibitors did, and people taking them typically showed higher rates of improvement than those taking MAO inhibitors. On the other hand, some people respond better to MAO inhibitors than to either tricyclics or the new antidepressants described next, and such people continue to be given MAO inhibitors. Second-generation antidepressants. A third group of effective antidepressant drugs, structurally different from the MAO inhibitors and tricyclics, has been developed during the past few decades. Most of these second-generation antidepressants are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, because they increase serotonin activity specifically, without affecting norepinephrine or other neurotransmitters. The SSRIs include fluoxetine, trade name PROZAC, sertraline, Zoloft, and escitalopram, Lexapro. More recently developed selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, such as atomoxetine, Strattera, which increase norepinephrine activity only, and serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, such as venlafaxine, Effexor, which increase both serotonin and norepinephrine activity, are also now available. In effectiveness and speed of action, the second-generation antidepressant drugs are about on a par with the tricyclics, yet their sales have skyrocketed. Clinicians often prefer the new antidepressants because it is harder to overdose on them than of the MAO inhibitors or produce some of the unpleasant effects of the tricyclics, such as dry mouth and constipation. At the same time, the new antidepressants can produce undesirable side effects of their own. Some people gain weight or have a reduced sex drive, for example. Decisions about which kinds of antidepressants are prescribed for patients can also be influenced by other factors, such as insurance coverage or financial means. People who have been helped by the antidepressants readily sing their praises. Consider, for example, the following comments, offered in a recent survey of antidepressant users. Going on PROZAC was literally going from black and white to color. The psychiatrist put me on an SSRI, and it really helped. Within a couple weeks I felt like I was me again, and I hadn't been me for a long time. Zoloft helps me not feel despair. I guess that's kind of vague, but when despair actually feels tangible, then there's nothing vague about it. Within a few weeks of starting PROZAC, I felt a really big difference. You know, life was still filled with problems. But suddenly it was just, they were problems, not this overbearing force. I started taking Lexapro, and within a week, I felt like a human being again. I could feel something changing inside of me. I could feel this different kind of light, this support, this capability that I didn't have before. It was very supportive. It was kind of like someone was holding my hand the entire time. As popular as the antidepressants are, it is important to recognize that they do not work for everyone. In fact, even the most successful of them fails to help at least 35% of clients with depression. In fact, some recent reviews have raised the possibility that the failure rate is higher still, especially for people with mild or modest levels of depression. How are clients who do not respond to antidepressant drugs treated currently? Researchers have noted that, all too often, their psychiatrists or family physicians simply prescribe alternative antidepressants or antidepressant mixtures one after another, without directing the clients to psychotherapy or counseling of some kind. Melissa, a depressed woman for whom psychotropic drug treatment has failed to work over many years, reflects on this issue. She spoke, in a wistful manner, of how she wished her treatment could have been different. I do wonder what might have happened if, at age 16, I could have just talked to someone, and they could have helped me learn about what I could do on my own to be a healthy person. I never had a role model for that. They could have helped me with my eating problems, and my diet and exercise, and helped me learn how to take care of myself. Instead, it was, you have this problem with your neurotransmitters, and so here, take this pill Zoloft, and when that didn't work, it was take this pill PROZAC, and when that didn't work, it was take this pill Effexor, and then when I started having trouble sleeping, it was take this sleeping pill, she says, her voice sounding more wistful than ever. I am so tired of the pills. Brain stimulation. In recent years, 3 additional biological approaches have been developed for the treatment of depressive disorders: vagus nerve stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and deep brain stimulation. Vagus nerve stimulation. The vagus nerve, the longest nerve in the human body, runs from the brain stem through the neck down the chest and on to the abdomen, serving as a primary channel of communication between the brain and major organs such as the heart, lungs, and intestines. A number of years ago, a group of depression researchers surmised that they might be able to stimulate the brain by electrically stimulating the vagus nerve. They were hoping to mimic the positive effects of ECT without producing the undesired effects or trauma associated with ECT. Their efforts gave birth to a new treatment for depression: vagus nerve stimulation. In this procedure, a surgeon implants a small device called a pulse generator under the skin of the chest. The surgeon then guides a wire, which extends from the pulse generator, up to the neck and attaches it to the vagus nerve. Electrical signals travel from the pulse generator through the wire to the vagus nerve. The stimulated vagus nerve then delivers electrical signals to the brain. The pulse generator, which runs on battery power, is typically programmed to stimulate the vagus nerve and, in turn, the brain every 5 minutes for a period of 30 seconds. In 2005, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, approved vagus nerve depression that have not improved even after the use of at least 4 other treatments. The reason for this approval? Ever since vagus nerve stimulation was first tried on depressed human beings in 1998, research has found that the procedure brings significant relief. Indeed, in studies of severely depressed people who have not responded to any other form of treatment, as many as 40% improve significantly when treated with vagus nerve stimulation. As with ECT, researchers do not yet know precisely why vagus nerve stimulation reduces depression. After all, like ECT, the procedure activates neurotransmitters and areas all over the brain. This includes, but is not limited to, serotonin and norepinephrine and the brain areas that have been implicated in depression. Transcranial magnetic stimulation. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, is another technique that is being used to try to stimulate the brain without subjecting depressed patients to the undesired effects or trauma of ECT. In this procedure, first developed in 1985, the clinician places an electromagnetic coil on or above the patient's head. The coil sends a current into the prefrontal cortex. As you'll remember from the previous chapter, at least some parts of the prefrontal cortex of depressed people are underactive. TMS appears to increase neuron activity in those regions. TMS has been tested by researchers on a range of disorders, including depression. A number of studies have found that the procedure reduces depression when it is administered daily for 2 to 4 weeks. Moreover, according to a few investigations, TMS may be just as helpful as ECT when it is administered to severely depressed people who have been unresponsive to other forms of treatment. In 2008, TMS was approved by the FDA as a treatment for major depressive disorder. Deep brain stimulation. Researchers have recently linked depression to high activity in Brodmann Area 25, a brain area located just below the cingulate cortex. And some suspect that this area may be a kind of depression switch. This finding led neurologist Helen Mayberg and her colleagues, 2005, to administer an experimental treatment called deep brain stimulation, DBS, to 6 severely depressed patients who had previously been unresponsive to all other forms of treatment, including electroconvulsive therapy. Mayberg's approach was modeled after deep brain stimulation techniques that had been used successfully in cases of brain seizure disorder and Parkinson's disease, both of which are related to overly active brain areas. For depression, the Mayberg team drilled 2 tiny holes into the patient's skull and implanted electrodes in Area 25. The electrodes were connected to a battery, or pacemaker, that was implanted in the patient's chest, for men, or stomach, for women. The pacemaker powered the electrodes, sending a steady stream of low-voltage electricity to Area 25. Mayberg's expectation was that this repeated stimulation would reduce Area 25 activity to a normal level and recalibrate and regulate the depression brain circuit. In the initial study of DBS, 4 of the 6 severely depressed patients became almost depression-free within a matter of months. Subsequent research with other severely depressed individuals has also yielded promising findings. In addition to significant mood improvements, patients undergoing the procedure have reported improvements in their short-term memory and quality of life. Understandably, all of this has produced considerable enthusiasm in the clinical field. Nevertheless, it is important to recognize that research on DBS is in its earliest stages. Investigators have yet to run properly controlled studies of the procedure using larger numbers of research participants to determine its long-term safety or to fully clarify its undesired effects. We must remember that in the past, certain promising brain interventions for psychological disorders, such as the lobotomy, later proved problematic or even dangerous upon closer inspection. How do the treatments for unipolar depression compare? For most kinds of psychological disorders, no more than 1 or 2 treatments or combinations of treatments, if any, emerge as highly successful. Unipolar depression seems to be an exception. One of the most treatable of all abnormal patterns, it may respond to any of several approaches. During the past 20 years, researchers have conducted a number of treatment outcome studies, which have revealed some important trends. 1. Cognitive behavioral, interpersonal, and biological therapies are all highly effective treatments for unipolar depression, from mild to severe. In most head-to-head comparisons, they seem to be equally effective at reducing depressive symptoms. However, there are indications that some populations of depressed patients respond better to one therapy than to another. In a pioneering 6-year study of this issue, experimenters separated 239 moderately and severely depressed people into 4 treatment groups. One group was treated with 16 weeks of Beck's cognitive therapy, another with 16 weeks of interpersonal psychotherapy, and a third with the tricyclic drug imipramine. The fourth group received a placebo. A total of 28 therapists conducted these treatments. Using a depression assessment instrument called the Hamilton Rating Scale for depression, the investigators found that each of the 3 therapies almost completely eliminated depressive symptoms in 50 to 60% of the participants who completed treatment. Only 29% of those who received the placebo showed such improvement. This trend also held, although somewhat less powerfully, when other assessment measures were used. These findings are consistent with those of most other comparative outcome studies. The study found that drug therapy reduced depressive symptoms more quickly than the cognitive and interpersonal therapies did. But these psychotherapies had matched the drugs in effectiveness by the final 4 weeks of treatment. In addition, more recent studies suggest that cognitive and cognitive behavioral therapy may be more effective than drug therapy at preventing recurrences of depression, except when drug therapy is continued for an extended period of time. Despite the comparable or even superior showing of cognitive and cognitive behavioral therapies, in the past few decades there has been a significant increase in the number of prescriptions written for antidepressants, from 2.5 million in 1980 to 4.7 million in 1990 to 254 million today. 2. Although the cognitive behavioral, and interpersonal therapies may lower the likelihood of relapse, they are hardly relapse-proof. Some studies suggest that as many as 30% of the depressed patients who respond to these approaches may, in fact, relapse within a few years after the completion of treatment. In an effort to head off relapse, some of today's cognitive behavioral, and interpersonal therapists continue to offer treatment, perhaps on a less frequent basis and sometimes in group or classroom formats. After the depression lifts, an approach similar to the continuation or maintenance approaches used with ECT and antidepressant drugs. Early indications are that treatment extensions of this kind do in fact reduce the rate of relapse among successfully treated patients. In fact, some research suggests that people who have recovered from depression are less likely to relapse if they receive continuation or maintenance therapy in either drug or psychotherapy form, irrespective of which kind of therapy they originally received. 3. When people with unipolar depression have significant discord in their marital relationships, couple therapy tends to be as helpful as cognitive behavioral, interpersonal, or drug therapy. 4. In head-to-head comparisons, depressed people who receive strictly behavioral therapy have shown less improvement than those who receive cognitive behavioral, interpersonal, or biological therapy. Behavioral therapy has, however, proved more effective than placebo treatments or no attention at all. Behavioral therapy is of less help to people who are severely depressed than to those with mild or moderate depression. 5. Most studies suggest that traditional long-term psychodynamic therapies are less effective than these other therapies in treating all levels of unipolar depression. Many psychodynamic clinicians argue, however, that this system of therapy simply does not lend itself to empirical. 6. Studies have found that a combination of psychotherapy, usually cognitive behavioral, or interpersonal, and drug therapy is modestly more helpful to depressed people than either treatment alone. 7. These various trends do not always carry over to the treatment of depressed children and adolescents. For example, a broad 6-year project called the Treatment for Adolescents with Depression Study, TADS, indicates that a combination of cognitive and drug therapy may be much more helpful to depressed teenagers than either treatment alone. 8. Among biological treatments, ECT appears to be somewhat more effective than antidepressant drugs for reducing depression. ECT also acts more quickly. Half of patients treated by either intervention, however, relapse within a year unless the initial treatment is followed up by continuing drug treatment or by psychotherapy. In addition, the new brain stimulation treatments seem helpful for some severely depressed people who have been repeatedly unresponsive to drug therapy, ECT, or psychotherapy. When clinicians today choose a biological treatment for mild to severe unipolar depression, they most often prescribe one of the antidepressant drugs. In some cases, clients may actually request specific ones based on recommendations from friends or on ads they have seen. Clinicians are not likely to refer patients for ECT unless the depression is severe and has been unresponsive to drug therapy and psychotherapy. ECT appears to be helpful for 50 to 80% of the severely depressed patients who do not respond to other interventions. If a depressed person seems to be at high risk for suicide, the person's clinician sometimes makes the referral for ECT treatment more readily. Although ECT clearly has a beneficial effect on suicidal behavior in the short run, studies do not clearly indicate that it has a long-term effect on suicide rates.